Hello and welcome to the Selyem 2022 Spring Virtual Tasting. I'm Mark Malpede. I'm going to be your MC tonight. For those of you who have joined us before, this one's going to be a little different in the past because of the 2020 vintage. Jeff Mangahas, our winemaker, who I'll introduce in a moment, is going to go a little more in depth into the science of winemaking and how we deal with some of the smoke issues. Because part of the virtual preview is to tell you about the wines and really to assure you of their quality when you're buying them before you're tasting them. I know that everyone knows we have a great track record and we stand behind that. But when vintages like this come up, we want to assure you that these wines are tremendous and how we get to that conclusion. I'll turn it over to Jeff in a minute. He'll give you a little bit about the vintage and the science of everything, and then we'll talk about the wines. I want to encourage everyone to put comments and questions in the chat. Tell us where you're from, what bottle you opened tonight. Hopefully it's William Selyem, but anything's good. Even the beer and bourbon that are going on out there. So sit back, enjoy. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, either during the broadcast or at the end. If we don't get to your question, we will try to follow up later through email. So right now I'd like to introduce Director of Winemaking, Jeff Mangahas, who will take it from here, and I'll jump in here and there when I can. Jeff?
Sounds good. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Yeah, it's been an exciting 21 vintage. Excited for these wines to get released, and yeah, thanks for joining us. Yeah, let's jump in. We've got quite a few things to kind of cover. And as Mark said, feel free to ask some questions and so forth. But yeah, I've been farming grapes and making wine in the Russian River Valley now for, gosh, over 20 vintages here in the Russian River Valley, and I can certainly attest to the fact that each one is very unique and different. Each one has a story that to tell that ultimately has an impact on the wines. I can remember back to my days. I've been making wine at Dutton Goldfield, Hartford Court, and now here, obviously, at William Selyem. And I remember back in '03, for example, there was Labor Day heat spikes, young plants, really challenging vintage. Certainly my first year here at William Selyem, 2011 was a very cool flowering season, a very late season. So that had a lot of challenges as well. And then our most recent challenge, the 21 vintage, with sort of epic drought conditions. So yeah, each one has a unique story. And, I look back on each vintage as a success. Hopefully, I've learned a little bit something about growing grapes, and been doing it for a while, but there's always something to learn, and I take a lot of pride in being able to kind of navigate that. Those challenges. We have perfect execution, and so I look at each one as a learning opportunity, and certainly 2020, that was certainly the case. Really the season, the discussion about the season starts, sort of this time of year, which really kind of relates to how much rainfall we had, what the early growing season was like. And, 2020 started out with below average rainfall. That's not a surprise. It seems like we're in a sort of a perpetual drought in California. And on average, we had about 30% lower rainfall. So that sort of hampered us a little bit. With that said, we still had 21 inches of rain, which is, I think, enough to sustain a growing season. We had frosty early season, kind of spring weather. Really not a problem for us because we have frost protection in place in a lot of vineyards. But thankfully, actually, in the springtime, the late spring, a little bit of rain after bud break, which kind of recharged the soil. So the plants were in pretty good shape. Overall, the season was very moderate. It was moderate warm, but moderate in the sense that we didn't have a lot of dramatic heat spikes. And You've seen me show this graph in the past, which is the calculation of the growing degree day, which I'm not going to show here. But in the end, it was very interesting because the season finished up about 12% warmer than average. And so, certainly in the last decade or so, decade plus, it was certainly one of the warmer growing seasons. The next warmest growing seasons were 2013, 2014, 17, and 19, which all are actually, in my book, really terrific vintages. So the significance of that is, throughout the growing season, the plants enjoyed really a nice growth cycle. How that sort of manifested itself later in the season was lignified shoots, and what I mean by that are brown shoots, and certainly the stems were nice and ripe, and that's sort of important for us in the respect that we use whole cluster in the fermentation. So really nice brown stems, brown shoots, terrific color development. And so to me, it was a very high potential season because the growing season was unlike any other, and also just, perfectly balanced. I remember early, right before the harvest, walking through with John Bucher at his vineyard and just sort of remarking to him that I thought this was potentially one of the more exciting vintages in recent times. And he definitely agreed. And certainly a lot of our growers definitely agreed with how perfect the growing season was. As we got closer to the harvest season, obviously I look at weather a lot. One of the many hats, is being a meteorologist, looking at long-term forecasts for rain, heat, or what have you. And it was forecasted in the early part of August for really intense heat, 110 plus. And, Pinot Noir, if you've ever seen it, I maybe even talked about it before, is very thin-skinned grape and does not respond well to heat. So I decided to start the harvest in 2020 on August the 12th, certainly with a sense of urgency because this heat was going to be really intense for a sustained period of time. And owing to the really good early season growth, again, ripeness of the tannins were there, sugars were there. And so it was a really easy call to protect the integrity of the fruit and start the harvest on August 12th. By August 17th, West Side Road, East Side Road, and a number of vineyards in the Santa Rosa kind of plain area were harvested. And that ended up being fortuitous, right? Because if you're from the area, or if you remember the early morning hours of August the 17th, there was a dry lightning storm that moved through Northern California. And in the kind of the coastal hill area, coastal mountaintops, ignited a fire, which would later become or known as the Walbridge Fire. And as it moved down the coast, it started other fires. There was one down in the Santa Cruz mountains. There was another fire that was burning in the Lake Berryessa area. So definitely kind of wreaked havoc at the start of harvest. So while I had already picked a number of our grapes by the 17th, we continued to pick grapes for a period of time thereafter. Thankfully, any issues related to smoke were not. The smoke didn't really settle until almost a week later. So, kind of depending on your location, smoke definitely was a concern. And I was looking at location, proximity to the fire and the smoke, the time left to hang on the vine, the intensity of the smoke. Those were all factors that I needed to sort of assess. Kind of as an aside thing, obviously we're still going through the pandemic, at that time. Other issues that we had to deal with. West Side Road was actually evacuated and closed for a period of time. And again, while this wonderful growing season, grapes were ready, I kept on picking grapes, and I really thank some of our colleagues and other wineries in the area that were in safe zones. I diverted some of the fruit to those wineries, so we were still able to make wine, get it off the grapes, and really mitigate any potential issues. In addition to that, I just want to shout out to the winemaking team and the staff, the interns. We were punching down grapes through all this. It was pretty crazy. So really kudos to everybody for making these wines happen. Without them, none of this would have been possible. So as the smoke started to settle a week later, definitely there were some concerns, and really, I didn't know. We didn't really know that much about how it was going to affect the grapes. So immediately set out some goals to try and figure out. Thankfully, we have some analytical tools to be able to test for some of the smoke compounds, and figure out if we had an issue. It was pretty clear that we didn't really know that much about what we were testing and as an industry. And so part of the goal also was to be testing grapes to figure out and help establish baseline smoke numbers certainly for future years. And hopefully we don't have these issues in future vintages, but obviously that could be a reality. Another piece of information that we really didn't know, so maybe what we didn't know was what was present as far as smoke volatiles in other vintages, meaning non-smoke years. So that was a key piece of information to be able to compare the numbers that we were going to get from this particular vintage. So in total, we spent a lot of money trying to figure out test by test grapes, vineyards, different fermentations, different wines, previous vintages. As this massive, and we have this massive database of information that's really interesting to kind of decipher through.
It's actually pretty interesting that we feel like the research and testing that we've done is more than pretty much what the universities have on this, because there were fires in 2008, but people didn't do a lot with the information. So if you weren't tracking this yourself, like Jeff was, a lot of this information we had to create ourselves by working with, we were working with some labs out in Cornell. Jeff was doing some experiments because Australia has some of this information, but they haven't shared it with the industry. So we were starting from the ground up. So Jeff was really doing some groundbreaking work on smoke research. So, and Jeff, since I brought up 2008, can you touch on a second just how these fires were different from 2008 a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. Again, there's just so much information to cover here. So what's really interesting about the main difference with the 2020 fires versus 2008 was that the 2020 fire was really close to the harvest date, which is pretty significant in the sense that as opposed to 2008 vintage, which was like pre-veraison, pre-color development, the plants were still metabolically very active. And I think one of the biggest diversions between the two is that the plants didn't really have time to assimilate the smoke compounds that were in the air. So the level of contamination is much lower. If it were to happen, again, much earlier when the plants are more metabolically active, I think there would be a higher percentage of wines that would have been contaminated. That's my theory, and just kind of looking at my numbers and sort of my knowledge. Kind of jumping to maybe more specifically about what's happening. There's a number of compounds, guaiacol, 4-methyl guaiacol, creosols, all these kind of compounds that are implicated in terms of smoke contamination. And these volatiles, so if you can picture a forest fire, an oak tree burning out in the woods, it's, in the forest, it's emitting these compounds that can come in contact with the grapes. Certainly if the smoke is sort of in that vineyard, for example, it enters likely through the skin of the grape, possibly through the leaves, but more than likely through the skin of the grape. And that free, what we call a free volatile form, certainly is something that we can smell and taste. But the plant does something really interesting. It almost has a rudimentary sort of immune response, right? So it detects this sort of foreign compound in the grape, in the system. The vines are still, or the grapes are still attached to the vines at this point, right? And it can take that volatile, that free volatile smoke compound, and it can actually sequester it in a way. It adds on enzymatically, chemically, adds on like a sugar molecule, for example. And this is the form that we call bound. That bound form is not volatile, so you can't smell it or taste it. But potentially these bound forms could come out during the fermentation. So, we were testing grapes, we were testing fermentations, we were testing wines, obviously tasting as well, but chemically testing these wines to look at the evolution or the potential evolution of these smoke related compounds. And certainly, we tested some grapes, and I'll get to it a little bit later. We definitely tested some grapes that were contaminated, and we didn't pick those vineyards. But a lot of the vineyards that were still on the vine but had a very short amount of time exposed to smoke, those tested negligible or kind of below the sensory threshold. More importantly, when I follow those wines all the way to finished wine state, and we compare those numbers to non-smoke years, for example, 2018, 2019, which were totally clean years, the numbers are actually indistinguishable from smoke years, from this vintage, our wines that we bottled, to the non-smoke years. So the conclusion that I come to is the numbers are so low, they're ubiquitous in the environment, and they're similar levels to non-smoke years. The most important thing is that extensive tasting with the wines, our skilled winemaking staff, myself included, came to the conclusion that the wines were clean. As another side note, there was an interesting study that I had read, was an internal kind of KJ study that looked at 10 years worth of wines that they had made in a controlled kind of situation, smoke years, non-smoke years, and they found the exact same result that we found, which was non-smoke years, these volatiles sort of just naturally coexist in the environment. And so gave me a lot of confidence that the research that we came up with our own wines, that our conclusion was sound and correct. These things just exist in the world.
So Jeff, let me just do a little quick summary, and then I have a question for you. So the wines that we made they smell and taste great. They're chemically below noticeable thresholds that are consistent with non-fire years, right?
That's correct.
And then there's a handful of wines that we didn't make because of the exact opposite, right? So
correct.
We did not make,
and I'll get to talking about those specifically.
And then the bound form question, which it might be a little too geeky for people, but the reason that's important is because today, if there were bound forms of these in these wines, they could then come out later in the wine, and what doesn't smell smoky now could smell smoky later, which is what happened to a lot of people's 2008 wines, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's a good summary for sure.
Okay.
And with the realization that in 2008 the plants had more time to certainly absorb the compounds, and had more time to add on that sugar compound or that glucoside, and create more bound forms. So yes, exactly. A lot of those wines ended up coming out much later in the kind of aging process.
So someone asked a great question that is, I think, really pertinent for this discussion. So a lot of people, some of our neighbors didn't make wine when we did. And the question was from Jeff Thomas was, you know, I think it was from Jeff Thomas, how were we able to do that? And they weren't. Well, a lot of this comes down to picking time, right? So if you were here in the beginning, the fire started on the 17th. Jeff started picking on August 12th. So we had a majority of our Russian River fruit in-house
Already in. Yeah.
and protected.
Yeah.
I think that's a key detail.
Well, and it's also important to realize that it's not so much, you had a couple of different windows, right? And if the smoke didn't settle in certain regions until a period of time much later, right? So kind of think of almost like a mushroom cloud of sort of smoke emanating from the start of the fire, right? So actually a lot of vineyards that were closer for a period of time where there was no smoke in those vineyards whatsoever. Oftentimes it was the furthest regions where that plume sort of kind of came down on those vineyards. Those ones were actually affected more quickly because the smoke settled in those vineyards very quickly after the fire. So what I said a little bit earlier related to, so 100%, we started picking on the 12th, picked through a lot of grapes before the smoke settled. But then even at that time, I think you still had a little bit of time before the plant started to absorb compounds that would create taint in wines, right? So I think there's a couple of factors involved there. So certainly comes down to picking decisions. Obviously, the later you pick, the more hang time there is on the vine, which obviously increases your exposure. So, I think it really comes down to, we tend to pick because of precision viticulture. I want to get the plants to a certain level of, I'm looking at tannin ripeness more than sugar. And this was a vintage, kind of going back to what I described, the early part of the growing season. Tannins were quite mature in this vintage. Kind of a similar situation. I saw a couple people are tasting 2015s, which I think are really terrific right now. That was a vintage we started harvest in July. We actually started it on July 31st. And that was because it was a really terrific early growing season. It was a light crop, but we started bud break in February, which is unheard of. So the plants had a really, easy time developing tannins, making mature flavors and that kind of thing. And we were able to pick early with perfect ripeness, from what I would consider perfect ripeness from a tannin perspective, at low potential kind of sugars. So in some respects 2020 was like that as well. Tannins were ripe, decided to start picking early enough. Let me jump to, so that's the great news. Some of the bad news is that vineyards that were affected, that were not anywhere close to being ready for the harvest, they had extended hang time to get up to ripeness. So vineyards like Terra de Promesio, Coastlands, Olivet Lane, and a number of other vineyards that we don't make vineyard designates from in the Sonoma Coast AVA. These are all wines that we didn't make, right? Because they tested positive for at the grape level. One interesting thing that I decided to do, so we kind of leased the Precious Mountain Vineyard as of a number of years ago, and that one definitely had some smoke tainted compounds on the grapes. But I decided to pick those grapes to try and learn something about the testing, how these bound forms become evolved out of the wine. And really fascinating, definitely orders of magnitude higher than background levels for these various smoke compounds. The wine tastes like your favorite barbecue sauce. It's pretty amazing. And those numbers were just through the roof, right? So very interesting. Learned a little bit about what compounds are important. The evolution of some of these bound forms throughout the fermentation. It was pretty fascinating because you could taste it a little bit on the grapes because the numbers were already elevated. Throughout the fermentation, you can just see these bound forms. Just it would get more and more smoky as the the fermentation kind of continued. And we bottled a couple of cases of it just to follow, do tests and follow it. It's pretty fascinating sort of stuff.
It's
But
nasty.
what's it? Yeah, you tasted it, right, Mark? It's
Yeah.
pretty intense. Pretty fascinating, though.
Yeah. So a couple of points, and then we need to get to tasting. I want to answer a question from Steve Zellman. So he says, so the grapes you picked were estate grapes, right? But most of your wine comes from non-owned vineyards. So how did you evaluate those? These were all over Russian River. So they were some of our estate grapes, but they were, we were able to make Rocchioli and Allen and Bucher and other wines from the area. It was really the coastal wines that had the biggest impact because those are much later ripening. But one important point, Jeff mentioned Olivet Lane. So we weren't able to make an Olivet Lane Pinot Noir, but Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Zin all interact with smoke differently. So we were able to actually make an Olivet Lane Chardonnay, which we're going to taste in just a second.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so to kind of recap, a lot of the coastal, cooler, later sites, our Drake Vineyard included, we didn't pick because of taint, potential for taint. In the future, we're going to continue to test grapes to kind of understand what that background level of and I refrain from using the word taint because I think these are compounds that are just naturally existing in the world, and part of the general sort of terroir. We need to understand what that sort of baseline level is. As Mark sort of alluded to, it's Pinot Noir is so special in many different ways, right? I mean, we love it as a wine, but there's a lot of it's sort of that falls into the category of Pinot Noir is difficult to to grow, difficult to make, and there are definitely some really interesting chemical differences about Pinot Noir that I think also make it the most susceptible of grape varieties as it relates to smoke. I won't get into the details, but there are actually some really interesting enzymatic things that are unique to Pinot Noir. As I mentioned earlier about how it enters through the skin, the smoke compounds, if we look at the way Chardonnay is made, so let me take a step back. Those compounds, when you make red wines, those wines are kind of, or when you in the red wine making process, those compounds are in contact with the skin, right? So the potential for extracting those compounds is much higher, right? Chardonnay is a little different, or any white wine really for that matter, that is harvested, whole cluster pressed. There's very little time. That contact, or the amount of time to press the grapes and take it off the skins is relatively quick. And that extractant, we actually use very gentle sort of pressures to extract the juice when we're doing whole cluster pressing on white wines. So testing those juices, testing those wines, testing those ferments, the conclusion in tasting and testing the wines, those wines were clean of either the free compounds or the bound forms. And again, comparing to other vintages, I mean, the wines, actually the numbers are virtually zeros. So, and then comparing that to previous vintages, everything was sort of in line. So again, high confidence that these compounds they just don't exist in the Chardonnay. Interestingly enough, Zinfandel, Cabernet, which are both really late harvest, harvested grapes, they don't seem to operate in the same way Pinot Noir does. Again, I think it relates to how Pinot Noir has, specific enzymatic activities that maybe are important in sequestering these smoke volatiles. Similar Zinfandel, Cabernets, as many of you know, we're making a little bit of Cabernet these days. And that was actually picked before the glass fire, all of our Cabernets. And those compounds, they just don't exist in Cabernet wines, at least for wines that we picked before the glass fire. there were definitely some wines that were picked after the glass fire, just through other kind of accounts, and those wines definitely or potentially had some taint. I can't speak to those other wines; those are in other people's cellars. But um, Zinfandel and Cab appear to be totally healthy and fine.
And Jeff, I think, there have been a couple of questions about the impact of ambient smoke while you're making wine and things like that. And I think I can summarize repeating what you've said a number of times to us, which is, it's a combination of factors. The location of the fires and the proximity of the fire to the vineyard, the stage of the grape where it's in the growing process,
Right.
the amount of time sitting in smoke. So, 5 minutes probably doesn't matter, and 20 days is going to have a big impact. So
Right.
it's not one factor. So all of these things come together to wrap this up to say that each wine had to be evaluated individually.
That's
Because
correct.
we're talking two different fires in the 20 growing season, one over in Napa, where again, we had just picked the wine before the fire hit, where other people didn't. So our grapes are fine and others aren't. So it's, there's not a one size fits all for any of this.
And that's it. And sadly, as an industry, there's still a lot that we don't know, right? And I think the exact mechanisms of the creating the bound forms in the plants, the type of smoke, what types of trees are burning, and given fires, all those things have specific factors. In addition to just general, what is the state of the plant by the time something a forest fire happens. So there's still a lot that we don't know. I feel like we know a lot, sort of internally, but like I started out the kind of the webinar with, each season's very different. There's a slew of factors that may or may not influence, a downstream effect. So it's a bit of a crapshoot, to be honest. But and the bottom line is, I think, the testing, the level of tasting that we did, the level of testing, I feel like these wines are they're I don't want to say they're perfect, but they're because there's no perfect wine out there, but they're going to be free of taint. So from the best that we can analyze them and compare them to other vintages. So
well, that's a perfect segue into actually tasting some of the wines.
Yeah.
So there are 10 wines in this release. As Jeff mentioned, we didn't make Terre de Promisio, Olivet Lane Pinot Noir, and our Sonoma Coast blend. The wines we did make, though, that's what we'll talk about now. So the first one up is our unoaked Chardonnay. So
So the unoaked, hopefully you guys have a lot of experience with this wine. A lot of older vines. I actually just had a really terrific conversation a couple of days ago with Letty Teague about our unoaked Chardonnay. She was super intrigued about it. And she was fascinated by, wow, it was so rich and complex, and how do you do that without the oak? And really the answer here is a lot of the vines that go into this particular wine are much older vines. And it's a Russian River appellation wine, right? So a couple of different vineyard sources, but the older vines tend to have, to me, a little bit thicker skin. And we don't often talk about, or maybe you've heard me talk about, tannin structure in white wines. And I think that older vines tend to have a little thicker skin. And when you do that whole cluster pressing, there's a certain amount of tannin that's extracted in a good way that creates body and richness. So I think that's one of the key elements. But what's good for barrel fermented Chardonnays is also good for stainless steel fermented Chardonnay, which is lees contact, right? So we typically keep this on the primary lees. So that's the yeast cells, the grape proteins, that kind of thing. And we stir the tank pretty regularly. So that mimics the same sort of same sort of concept as batonnage in a barrel fermented Chardonnay, which is meant to really create richness. So by doing that in a tank instead of a barrel, you achieve the same sort of kind of textural fullness in the wine. Pretty great nose. Got a Russian River nose to me. That yellow apple, quince, pear, green apple, those kinds of notes. You don't really miss the oak in this wine. Completely bone dry, but again, that richness from the lees contact and the tannin contribution from really excellent vineyard sourcing.
Yeah, this is very typical of our unoaked, and the richness that Jeff's talking about is, you get this full-bodied flavor from the grapes, but you don't have the kind of the buttery and the oaky elements to it. So it's this real crisp, clean, but unlike, I drink a lot of unoaked wines from Chenin Blanc and Sauvignon Blanc, things like that, but you get I don't mean from a flavor perspective, I mean from a body perspective, like a meatiness to this wine where it really, I want food to go with it. It's not light in any way. So I think it's pretty, it's got that beautiful citrusy nose to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, great job. Next up is from the Heinz Vineyard. So
so I think one of the great terroirs actually in Russian River Valley, mostly known for its Chardonnay. This kind of sits on the very sort of far west edge of kind of where, to me, it can be almost a Sonoma Coast vineyard because it's at 800-foot elevation, kind of right on the edge of the boundary of Russian River, Sonoma Coast. It's got a really unique soil profile. It's got that classic Gold Ridge sandy loam kind of soil, which is this real kind of flocculent. It almost looks like talcum powder when you kind of walk in it, and it's uplifted kind of ocean bottom soil, which is very depleted of nutrient. So struggle in the plants. Again, helps develop tannin structure. It's a warm site in kind of the Russian River Valley because it's at elevation. And, I often get sort of like pineapple notes, not so much like dried pineapple, but fresh pineapple. To me, it's, kind of a warm, ripe site, but slow ripening is typically one of our later vineyards to pick. Great acidity. This is barrel fermented. It goes through malolactic fermentation to balance out the acidity. Really stark contrast to the unoaked Chardonnay for sure, right, Mark?
Yeah, and for those who have been on the list for a long time, and I see a lot of you in the chats and comments, I feel like Jeff's winemaking style on Chardonnay is really honed in on this elegance. I think it's, and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, you pick it a little earlier than we had in the past. It's a little lower alcohol, and I think that elevates the fruit and the minerality to the wines a bit more. So I really feel like the winemaking differences have evolved a little bit more noticeably on Chardonnay than, say, Pinot and Zin.
Yeah, that's pretty fair. I mean, it's Pinot Noir, typically the same sort of parameters, same farming techniques, same, sort of bricks, acid levels, tannin ripeness. I'm looking for those kinds of things and definitely trying to kind of bring a little bit more acid focus and minerality to the wines, to the Chardonnays for sure. And then obviously great vineyards that we source from.
Yeah, and then next up is Olivet Lane Chardonnay. Now, I've always found the Olivet Chardonnay to be a little rounder on the front palate, a little more obviously fruit forward than, say, Heinz or some of our others. Would you agree with that, Jeff?
Yeah, so this particular vineyard is in the Santa Rosa kind of plain area. It's off of Olivet Road and the Piner sort of area. Um, you know, Nearly 50-year-old vines here. Uh, Again, kind of going back to that theme of thicker skin, tannin structure. Not quite as hot, I would say, as Heinz. So the fruit profile is definitely in that sort of. I mean, I'm just getting yellow apple and apple kind of notes. Not the greener side of apple, but definitely kind of that yellow apple kind of note. Um, Broad, again, no sugar left in the wine, really broad kind of profile. Definitely less minerally, say, compared to Heinz and maybe some of our other Chardonnays. Um, yeah, it's showing nice, actually.
Yeah, it's a pretty wine. Jeff's palate is, and especially his nose, is so much better than mine. So I
We
sometimes
just
have to
smell
lift.
things differently, I think, or
Yeah,
have different descriptors, but
yeah. I just have to lift notes from Jeff every now and then when we do this. Um, Now we'll jump into the Pinots. Our first Pinot is Central Coast Pinot Noir, and that gives me an opportunity to hit a couple of different questions on that have come up. We mentioned, again, smoke, proximity. Well, Central Coast is down outside our Central Coast vineyard, which is Vista Verde, is about 20 miles due east of Monterey. So the fires we were talking about in 2020 were literally, you know, 3 to 5 miles from us here at the winery, and you're about 200 miles south. So, not that they didn't have fires down there at different periods, but these fires were away from that. So the Central Coast Pinot Noir, as well as the Errol, the late harvest Gewurz, really no impact from that.
and
So
the Vista Verde in the fall, the
yes,
Vista Verde
and so
Pinot
Central
Noir.
Coast is a blend from what we refer to as younger vines at Vista Verde than the vineyard designate, but the vines are by no means young anymore. When we started making the Vista Verde, and I think 2001, there were young vines and old vines, and now all of those have aged another 20 years. So it's a different block with a different profile to it
Yeah,
than the
and
Vista
and
Verde.
there's a lot of experimentation that goes down there, with different clones, different root stocks, different aspects, and things like that, and so those usually end up in the Central Coast, sort of learning opportunities, if you will. But to me, it's got that classic sort of, Vista Verde, some berry fruit kind of character to it,
Mhm.
a little bit of floral character as well. A little bit, typically the wines, because the soils are sort of limestone. They very much have sort of a broad mouthfeel, very elegant, easy to drink. Um, you know, Got that really dark fruit character is really kind of coming out.
Yeah, and we make the Central Coast and the Sonoma County to be drunk earlier than the vineyard designates. It doesn't mean that these wines can't age. They age quite nicely, but the by going in less new oak and from Jeff's winemaking, we're able to have a wine that if you're going to drink something on the earlier side, the Central Coast and the Sonoma County are our recommendations. And they're, I'm trying the Central Coast maybe for the second time right now, thinking, it's ready to go right now. It's not that it won't get better with age, but you don't need to age it quite as long.
Yeah.
And I definitely get the dark fruit profile that you're talking about, Jeff, which, I don't always get in the Central Coast, but that could just be wine memory on my part.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, typically the season's a tiny little bit later than Russian River. So it has a really nice, long, slow growing season. Tends to develop, I think that berry fruit. Certainly, the Vista Verde to me has that sort of, dark fruit, berry, sometimes pomegranate kind of note to it. Um,
Hmm. Yeah, pretty. So then the next one we're going to taste is the Russian River Valley Pinot.
Russian River. Yeah. So, gosh, typically there's over the last couple of years have been really working with a multitude of, there's definitely some estate fruit that goes into here. Been sourcing some really terrific fruits from vineyards like from Benovia Winery, Martaella, some other vineyards in the Green Valley, and so forth. And been really working to source grapes from different parts of the Russian River. And to me, that's really kind of coming through in the wine. I think there's more complexity. I think there's more, diversity from a tannin perspective and a flavor profile. To me, it's got classic Russian River kind of notes to it. A little bit of, some floral notes, red fruits, citrus. Looking at my notes, I talk a lot about tea, really wonderful tea sort of elements on the back end of the palate. Wine that can definitely age well, but even just with a few years of age, I think it can be a really delicious wine. um what did I have the other day? I think the 2019 Russian River is tasting actually pretty nice right now. Terrific vintage. Similar vineyard sourcing as it is today. Um,
From a flavor profile perspective, is there a previous vintage that you would compare, not growing seasons or anything, just flavor perspective? What would you compare the 20s to?
oh gosh. I think what comes to mind are, and maybe kind of impacted by the growing season a little bit. 2013 vintage kind of comes to mind a little bit. Um, those wines had a kind of a combination of dark and red fruit kind of character, which I think this wine has a little bit as well. Um, yeah, I'd have to go back and kind of compare, but that immediately kind of comes to mind.
I'm going to hit a question from Ajit. Hope I'm saying that right. Because it's actually my part of things, so I can answer it without having to go to Jeff. How is this going to affect allocations? Well, simply put, when there are 3 fewer wines in it, no matter what, the allocations are going down. We made less of some wines, we made more of some. Actually, the Sonoma County blend we were able to make some more of, and usually that's allocated pretty tightly. So allocations are down across the board for every single customer. And it's, we've been selling out faster and faster. And so we do urge you that when the release opens to not wait too long. And Jeff, before we get into the Sonoma County, a question on clones, and I can answer French oak, Ronnie. Everything we do is in French oak.
Yep.
Aging. But is there a predominant clone that goes into the Russian River blend?
So typically, Bird always favored as well the Pomard clone, which typically is a thicker skinned clone, has a really nice mid palate weight to it, and typically can be sort of robust in its tannin profile. So there's quite a bit of Pomard that goes into here. In general, we tend to stay away from the Dijon type clones, which tend to be, I'd say, a little bit more susceptible to heat and dehydration and things like that. So some of the what we term California heritage clones, Pomard, Swan, Mount Eden, Martini, those tend to be the preferred clones that go into pretty much most of our wines, and certainly in the Russian River Valley blend for sure. Yeah.
Apparently, saying Pomard clone, it's now a drinking game, so everyone just have to drink. So, all right, let's get into Sonoma County. So Sonoma County is a blend of different vineyards all over Sonoma County. Again, made for a little bit earlier drinking. I think, I always look at this wine as a tremendous value given the price point. I feel like it over delivers year in, year out. So, Jeff, you want to?
Very, very elegant wine. Definitely is a wine that over delivers. I mean, if you think about our fruit sourcing, there's a kind of a trickle down effect, maybe some really terrific vineyards that don't make Russian River or Sonoma Coast will end up in the Sonoma County. So, needless to say, there's always terrific fruit that goes into here. Might be a random barrel experiment, might be a press barrel, what have you, that might end up in this wine. But man, this is really open, isn't it? It doesn't have much oak in it. I mean, yeah, it's really meant to be something to consume while you're waiting for some of your AVA wines and certainly the vineyard designate wines. While those are quietly aging for a number of years, this is the one you're kind of reaching to on say a Tuesday night. Modest oak usage to kind of, there's not oak needs a little bit of time to integrate into the wines, and so this is ready to go.
This wine has changed dramatically since the last time we tasted it. I think it's drinking beautifully. I think I would compare this, on par with any recent vintages of Sonoma County. It's got a beautiful red fruited component that I like about it.
Cherry, strawberry notes. Yeah, and that's what it's about.
Yeah, and I'm kind of laughing at the comments because yes, buy more and age them. That's what we're hearing. This is the one year where we certainly, if you don't want to buy more, there are plenty of people lined up who will take it because the allocations are definitely going to take a little bit of a hit this year.
Sadly.
Yeah. So Sonoma County. Then we get to one of my favorite wines. Just about every spring release. And while we talk about the West Side Road Neighbors, I've seen it a couple of times. The newsletter and tasting notes are available on the website. And we are mailing it significantly sooner than we have in the past because the combination of postal service slowing down and having trouble printing with supply chain issues has put things way behind. So we're actually the mailing will drop on Monday, which is a week before the release opens, and the tasting notes and the newsletter are on the website already. So all this information is out there. West Side Road Neighbors is a blend of 6 vineyards along West Side Road, our estate vineyard, the Rocchioli Vineyard, the Allen Vineyard, Foss, Bucher, and while we don't make a Bacigalupi Pinot Noir, we do buy a little bit of Pinot Noir fruit from the Bacigalupis to go into the West Side Road Neighbors. So these are literally our neighbors along West Side Road, which was how we named the wine in the first place. So Jeff.
Yeah, and that picture right there is pretty, telling. The soil type in this part of the Russian River Valley called the Middle Reach, it's this sort of red soil inflected, mineral sort of rich soil. And it really, to me, delivers, a nice balance of refined tannin structure, nice red fruit character, and a wine that's very age worthy. Not wrong to drink it when it's young because it has a lot of appeal, nice red fruit character, minerality, that kind of thing. But man, this can age pretty well. I mean, I'm sure you've had pretty epic bottles of West Side Road Neighbors. 14 comes to mind actually as something that's really quite terrific right now, actually.
Actually opened a 15 this past weekend that was just stunning. These wines age great. Couple of people have asked about events and pickup weekend. We still don't know, and I'm sorry, but right now Sonoma County has probably the strictest COVID regulations of anywhere in California. We can't gather outside in groups of 50 or more, and inside is capped at 12 or something like that. So we really don't know. I wish we could answer the question more fully. We will, if I had to guess, spring is going to be either a small event or none. And we're eyeing fall, but everything's a guess right now, including what we'll be doing out at Millbrook. So we'll communicate with you all when we can. It's not ideal, but we're hoping to get, things will clear up for us in the next month or so, and we'll have a better idea. Keep your fingers crossed. We wish we could be hanging out with you guys too. So
Absolutely.
West Side's drinking great as well.
Oh yeah, no, terrific. Great fruit character, really kind of open for business, but you can tell with those tannins, again, kind of what I talked about, the early kind of growing season, really terrific polish to the tannins. I think there's a lot of tannin in these wines in general. They just need maybe a year or so to kind of soften up, but there's really terrific refinement, I think, in the tannin profile. Moving to the Zin, same situation. I mean, tasting this Pepera, which is always, has a good structure to it. It's a really nice low acidity or low pH, high acidity kind of profile. Berry fruits. It's got that sort of floral character to it as well. Another kind of classic Zinfandel in the making. Typically Zinfandel from Russian River is going to be acid focused, right? Just because of the cool nights, the what's good for Pinot Noir, that fog influence is also really good for Zinfandel.
I guarantee I don't have COVID right now, because this thing, the aromatics of this are crazy good. I mean, it's got that blackberry, that boysenberry. I mean, I don't know if something can smell juicy, but this smells juicy.
And what's also sort of the delicate side of it too. I mean, there's just this lift of like floral. I'm getting it as lavender today, but definitely a little bit of a floral character. A real nice detail, I think, in the wine. Also French oak, smaller amounts of oak compared to some of the Pinot Noirs. Zin's already robust enough; it doesn't need additional oak to kind of hold it up, if you will. Typically about 20 to 25% new French oak, and then the balance is 1 year, 2 year, and 3 year old barrels.
And we generally use Francois Frere on Pinot Noirs, French maker, and then Marcel Cadet on Chardonnay. And what are you using these days on Zin, Jeff?
Yeah, so for a while now, I've been using Taranceau, which is sort of a classic sort of Bordeaux kind of styled barrel, but it has really nice refined character to it. And so it's nice and supportive in terms of like, as opposed to masking the terrific tannin structure of Zinfandel. And the key there is the modest amount of oak usage.
So the next Zin is the Finucchi Wood Road, and just looking at my glasses lined up, this has a darker color to it.
Yeah, this is a really just terrific old vine. So just as a side note, the Pepera's, in the 20s, that's when it was planted. A lot of them, so definitely old, 100-year-old vineyard. This Finucchi alongside our Cytone in the fall, were both planted pre-1900, right? So this particular vineyard was planted in 1890. And as Mark commented on the color, old vines, lots of skin, lots of anthocyanin, lots of color development. But in addition, there's a tiny little bit of Alicante and a tiny little bit of Petit Syrah, just sort of sprinkled throughout the vineyard. So those are very colorful, intense, and it's only about 7% out in the field. So just a little goes a long way in terms of creating density and really colorful wine.
Yeah. So then I'm rushing a little at the back end as we're getting short on time, and we're going to move to our late harvest Gewürztraminer, also from the Vista Verde vineyard. Before we get to that, I just, because some people are logging off, we'll stay on a few minutes later if you want to stay, but if you have to go, thank you for joining us. I want to thank the team back who's producing this broadcast. Julie, Randy, Luke, and Jen, thanks for helping out. We appreciate the support you guys give us when we're here having fun drinking the wines. Somebody's got to do it, Jeff.
That's right.
So late harvest Gewürztraminer, I almost always say the exact same thing about it. It just, like, I just love smelling this wine. It smells like honeysuckle and beautiful ripe fruit.
The nose is intoxicating enough, right? In the sense that it jumps out of the glass. You have all this, Gewürz is kind of an interesting, grape variety. It's got, sort of this rosy kind of color to the grape itself. It smells like rose oil in some cases. It can smell like lychee, poached pears, and all this sort of like just all kind of the gamut of different exotic sort of fruits. This wine, it's really interesting. The oak, there's oak in this wine. It's barrel fermented and brand new oak, so it kind of complements, I think, that sort of nutmeg spice, allspice, kind of really complements that poached fruit character. That makes it really interesting. Acid is balanced with, I think, the sugar and the alcohol. Really a delicious way to end a meal, certainly with a nice, in the summertime. I love this with like a stone fruit tart of some kind. Would really be a nice match, I think. But super aromatic.
Yeah, like creme brulee would be a good one for that as well.
And it's real clean on the finish too, which is kind of shocking. Sometimes wines of this nature, they can be a little too cloying, and here it's, again, that balance of the oak, the acid, and the fruit profile. It really kind of creates a wine with really nice balance all the way around.
What do you think about aging of the late harvest Gewürz? I don't think we've ever talked about that, and Karen just asked a question on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think typically wines like this are well preserved. I don't think, it will definitely, the color will get a little bit darker with time. I mean, there's actually caramelization of the sugars that will happen. So it'll definitely get deeper in color. And I think along with that, it can really, you can get even darker, sort of more poached sort of flavors out of the wine. I think some of that floral character will go away and you'll get more dark fruit, almost maybe custardy type flavors and aromas. Although I don't age these wines all that often, to be quite honest. I tend to drink them young because I think they're fresh and more interesting, but that's not to say that they couldn't. Yeah.
For all of you guys out there in Wisconsin and Maine, and bundle up, people. We were just watching the 49ers game in Lambeau. Go Niners. And it was like below zero with the wind chill. It looks miserable. I grew up on the East Coast, so I know what that's like. But it's about 58 degrees out here in sunny California as the sun sets on a Thursday night. Well, thank you everybody for coming. We know that this is, it takes your time to come and listen to us do this, but hopefully you got some education out of it. Jeff, thank you.
Cheers.
Nailed the science on this, as always. Really interesting and educational. We miss seeing you guys in person at the big events, but hopefully you can come and visit us here at the winery, and we'll be able to travel soon. So maybe we'll see you this year, and hopefully, fingers crossed, later this year, next year, we get back to normal and we're hanging out in Millbrook and out on this deck where I'm standing above right now. Cheers, everyone. Have a great night. Enjoy this release. I think the wines are phenomenal, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.